Hey guys, welcome to the Ruby on Rails crash course. This is a course to kind of give you the scope of what Ruby on Rails is like in 2020. First off, I want to thank Traversary Media and the team there and the channel. It's been such an inspiration to see that channel thrive, and I've learned tons from it. The JavaScript in particular, it's been an eye-opener in terms of getting JavaScript in my head after several failed attempts. So very excited to be on the channel and supporting the cause. So first off, I want to say that, and second, if you haven't heard of me, I have a YouTube channel called Crunch. You could just find it on Web Crunch at YouTube. I also have a blog that basically every article or video I publish is typically followed with an actual article. So the website's web-crunch.com. So be sure to check that out if you're interested in more Ruby on Rails stuff, JavaScript, and CSS, a lot of front end and back end. What we're going to be working on in this video is building a basic food log app. And Ruby on Rails is a complete framework built with Ruby, of course, and another language called Rails, which was created by David Heinemeier Hansen, who works and co-founded Basecamp. So Ruby on Rails is used by tons of companies you've heard of, some of the biggest you've heard of too. So GitHub, Shopify, those are probably the biggest apps out there that run Ruby on Rails today. So check out the actual website. There's a lot of great guides, and the API is a great source to find more information about tons of stuff available to the framework. You can also check out my YouTube channel too if you're just new to it and want to get deeper in the scope of finding more about the framework. Website to check out also is my friend's site called GoRails. What I would recommend if you haven't installed Rails yet is to check out the guides on this site. I'll link to it in the description. Depending on your system, you'll need to install Rails a specific way. It depends on Ruby, of course. You'll need to install Ruby, and typically with those you need version managers and so forth. So if this is all kind of jumbled to you, I really recommend taking a look at these documents and getting them installed. I won't go through that in this video. That would be an video, of its own to kind of get under. So I would check out that. I'm running this on a Mac OS system, and I don't believe I'm on Catalina yet, but I'm on Mojave. I might be on Catalina. I can't even honestly remember. But I'm going to run this on that. I am on the latest version of Ruby and Rails, so we'll be running Bleeding Edge there. But otherwise, if you just run, even older versions, this should work in theory. We won't be using some of the new tech available in the framework because there's just so much to cover, but I want you to understand at least the basics with this episode. Under the hood, I'm also rocking Bulma for now just to save on some time in styling. I'm a really big fan of Tailwind CSS, but to do that in this video would kind of take over the video in terms of getting the front end scaffold, and Bulma just kind of brings some predefined styles to the table, so we'll use those. But we're going to be creating a food log app, and at its core, it's very simple. But a lot of these operations will kind of give you the scope of how Rails works, as well as understand the ins and outs of the framework. Ruby on Rails in particular is an MVC-based framework, which means model, view, and controller. Those three things are separated, but they do talk together. And typically in the model layer, that talks to a database. The controller layer kind of does the request, so the whole request cycle of the app. And the view layer is what you actually see. So the view, the data that gets printed and you can interact with as a user. And I just want to walk through the app quick. You enter a number for calories, proteins, carbohydrates, and fats. I'm kind of a health nut, so this is kind of ringing true to me. But when you add this data, it gets added to, I'll just do it. So we'll say dinner. Maybe I ate a ton of stuff for dinner. 40... 60, 30, just some random breakdown there. Presents this new entry. As you can see in the URL, it's an actual ID that gets added. There's tons of ways to kind of configure how that URL would look in the app. We won't go deep into that because that's just stuff you just learn as you go, but this is an icebreaker for that. But essentially, once you create that entry, you get to see it here on its own page. If you wanted to go to the root path of the site, you see all your entries for the current date. So if you were to add several meals here, you'll see all of them in this view. And that each day you visit the app, you'll see that for your specific day. You might be asking, well, what if I want to see all of the entries I've had? Well, I created a view for that are grouped by the date itself. And then you display basically an added format of each of these meals. So we do some calculations behind the scenes that present this stuff in an ad hoc fashion. So for each day, you'll get a breakdown. So if we were to add a new entry for tomorrow, there'd be another whole new August 28th entry down below with a grouping of those meals. All that plus some testing is in this video. It's going to probably be a kind of a long video, so just brace yourself. But I want you to know at least the ins and outs of the framework. So let's dig in. I'm going to assume you've installed Rails using the guide that I mentioned previously. Like I said, I really recommend just walking through that. It should get you up to spec. Windows machines are a little bit harder to get Ruby and Rails installed on. I know Windows has a subsystem for Linux now, at least modern versions, that you could probably use and get started with. This guide again mentions that, so definitely check that out if you are a Windows user. So like I said, I'm going to get started quickly here. We're going to get Bulma into the mix. I'm going to remove some of these tabs. I have this running locally right now on a new app, but we'll create a new app, and Rails is basically done via the command line. I'm going to go into my coding path, and I'll do a Rails new, and then what can we call it? We called it food log. And that's essentially it. Once you have Rails installed on your system, you can run this new command and it'll generate a whole app for you that's just basically ready to roll. So there are perks to using frameworks, and this is one of them. It kind of just generates the stuff you need depending on what you need. And you can pass in options on like almost any option under the sun when you create this stuff. So definitely read the documentation if you're interested in learning more. There's just so much to cover, so this video will be very brief in those aspects. Under the hood with Rails 6 is the current version that I'm using. Webpack is basically by default in these apps now. It used to be a different ecosystem where you use a lot more jQuery or vanilla JavaScript. What's different in these apps is that it's more dependent, at least on the JavaScript layer, of Webpack-based builds. So we won't get into too much of that in this video, but it is something to be aware of, that you can totally run front-end frameworks on this framework itself if you want to. And honestly, to be frank, a lot of apps out there now run Ruby on Rails as the back end of their app, and like something like React or Vue.js or Svelte on the front end. And that's up to you if you want to do that. With that comes different conventions to adhere to. So Ruby on Rails is very convention driven. So it's basically opinionated by design, and that's part of the perk of using it, because you can scaffold out a lot of things very quickly and get an app running in almost no time. Let me go and do the CD into the actual app we're gonna run. I'm using a fancy terminal theme here, so just don't worry about it too much, but it just gives me some readouts of where I'm at with using Git and whatnot. So we will use Git a little bit in this, but not too much, just to kind of keep track of where things are at, and just kind of make changes. So when I push this live, you guys will have the actual end result so you can refer to it. But typically, if I'm working on a typical app, at each milestone, I'll do a commit and add those changes, just so there's some history there to go back to if I need to. Actually, what you see above here is the actual look and feel of the app in terms of files and folders. There's a lot to it. At first, it's very overwhelming, and I promise you, the more you work with it, the more you'll just understand where things are and how they work together. But at first glance, don't worry if it's a little too much to take in. I'm using VS Code for my editor. We'll see basically all of the stuff ready to actually version control. So maybe I'll just do that so that's not green. So git add, the whole stack basically, git commit, init. And if we were to boot up this app at this point, if we say Rails server in our command line within that app, And I'm in that app if you want to see. If you do PWD, we're in that app now. If we do Rails server, we can actually boot up that app at its current state, which is basically a vanilla Ruby on Rails app. By default, Ruby on Rails apps run on localhost 3000. So right here is what you see that as. If I refresh, you'll see the actual welcome screen of Ruby on Rails. It'll actually print out your Ruby version and your Rails version, which these could be a little bit behind already. So at this point, we're at a place where we can think about how the app's going to work. And typically that's what I'll do when I build an app. So I'll think of the underlying data structure or problem I'm trying to solve, and in that case. So in our case, we're trying to make an app that is mostly a journal entry app. So there's no user authentication or anything right now, and that's something you can add later. And definitely check out other videos to understand that on my channel. There's a ton there. This is more of, let's get that entry taken care of. We'll get the calories, the proteins, the carbohydrates and fats, and then the actual date it was created on added to the app, so we can create that flow. So we'll do that now. And what's great about Rails is under the hood there's this entire CLI structure. So the Rails command is the biggest helpful command you'll run into on a framework like this. If you just type Rails in your command line, you'll see all these functions file back, and it's just almost endless of what you can do. So again, another overwhelming thing of such a large and mature framework. Underneath all of these commands, we've got available to us a way to generate things. So if you look at G, in the G section, it actually doesn't show here, which is kind of interesting. I thought it would. But there's a command called Rails generate. Actually, it's at the very top. It's the most common one. And it has a shortcut of G if you want to type less. So what we'll do, say Rails generate, or in short, G. We're going to generate our first, what's known as a model. So the model layer of the app. So we'll say model entry. And typically in a Rails app, a model is a singular word and typically capitalized. So what we'll do is pass in a few columns that will actually be on the database layer. Now when a Rails app is first booted up in default mode, it uses SQLite 3 under the hood. And you can use almost any database type under the sun for the Rails apps, but typically it's PostgreSQL, MySQL, or SQLite. And SQLite's fine in development mode, but in production, you'd probably use something like Postgres or MySQL. So a little behind the scenes info there. It's not important right now because we'll be doing this in development mode, but all that's taken care of in the development mode, which is great. If you recall, on the screen, we had that form. And what I want to add are these columns that are going to be the fields of that form. And these are going to be database columns in the database. So essentially this will be data we store in our database. And you can pass in the type of data it is from this command line. So in theory, we'll have all of this stuff ready to rock and roll. So a lot of Rails developers will shine away from the scaffold command, and that's mostly because it generates a lot of cruft under the hood. Scaffolding in Rails is the quickest way to get up and running with the CRUD-based operation. So CRUD is create, read, update, and destroy. So that's something you might do with a typical web app. So when you're creating, say, a blog post, you'll create the post. Maybe you want to edit it, you'll go edit it, and then you update it at that point. Oh, if you want to delete it, then you'd go delete it. So you could do all those operations with the Rails app. And honestly, it's boiled down now into these apps with one scaffold command like this to get that functionality. What's great about this is the speed. What's bad about it is the amount of files it generates and maybe cleanup you have to do later, which is why it's kind of frowned upon by purists in the field. So to each his own. I'm going to do it for the sake of this learning exercise. We'll go through and kind of talk about each situation and why it makes sense to do it the way it is, but you'd see this video would be quite long otherwise if I didn't do this command, and you'd see why in a second. So we'll pass in one called meal type, and it's going to be a string type in the database. The column name is to the left. The type of data is to the right. So we'll actually pass in calories and an integer, and then proteins will be integer, and then carbohydrates, integer, and then fats, integer. All numbers for those, because we'll just enter those in, as numbers as we see fit. It won't be perfect in the sense of like what you'd actually ate that day, like the actual food item, but it will be the caloric macronutrients makeup, I guess you could say. So let's go ahead and create this scaffold. And you'll see what it does here when I run this. I want to make sure I spelled everything correctly first. So we'll run this and you'll see it's going to create a ton of files for us, which is the bad part, but also the great part. If you look at this, we have a migration file. This is going to be the file that we can either modify fields in the database with through what's called migrations. So these commands you run to either go back in time or forward in time with your data, which is very handy. And then our model layer, and then our test layer. Our routing gets added here automatically. Notice it's pluralized here. So that's something interesting. When you pass in the singular version here, by the power of Ruby and Rails, they're pluralized in the sense of where it makes sense. So for our routing, entries is going to be the plural form. Same for controller and the views. So there's a new view folder called entries in this case. And then various other things. JBuilder is just a way to render JSON in a Rails app. It's not anything we need to be concerned about in this video. Helpers are handy methods of a handy place, I would say, to extract things that you use within your view layers typically. Test units, so unit tests will be basically here. We'll do system tests and controller tests coming up for this, just to show you how that works. In the Ruby world, tests are the emphasis of Ruby itself. Ruby is very dynamically typed language. It can be very loosely typed. So there's no like actual typing like a language like C or C+, or something like that. So in this case, we need to write a lot of tests to account for things. And that's kind of just the way things are. A lot of Rubyists practice the TDD or test-driven development. We won't be doing that per se here, but it is something you maybe want to read up about. Underneath the hood, we've got assets. SAS is already installed by default. We don't have to worry about that, which is great. And then for scaffolds, this generates a scaffold CSS file or SCSS file. We don't really need that, but I'm going to just show you what it does here in a second. So if we were to go to our app at this point, we've got new files, and the first one I'm going to show you is the migration file. This is what creates the new entry table. So it's underneath the hood. Rails has this DSL language or domain specific language that talks to an actual database for you. So you don't have to sit there and write MySQL by hand or anything like that. And that's, I think, a big reason people gravitate towards a framework like this is that intermediate layer of just kind of a humanistic way of writing data out that creates, in this case, a table with these fields on it. I don't have to touch any SQL, and it's just done. Now, these are our fields we typed in that command, you notice. And then we're going to create an entries table, which is plural. Notice that too. And then by default, when you create a new table, there's this field called timestamps that creates a created at field or column on the database and an updated at column. By default, those come with each of those new commands, whether it's a new model or a new scaffold. So those get that by default. Now in this layer, you could set some defaults if you wanted to, like calories would be 0 by default or proteins with 0. I'm going to leave it alone just to keep things less complicated. But this is where you would essentially interact with the data layer. And these are meant to be changed, and you'll see in a second a file that's not meant to be changed called the schema, which is actually kind of a visual representation of the database at its current state when you run a certain migration. So I'm kind of blazing over this stuff. There's a lot here to unpack, but I just want to kind of be thorough where it makes sense. So these are all those files that were added. Our main one that we'll be working in is the entry model class. We'll add some stuff here that makes sense coming up. And then our controller class, because we scaffolded it out, I've saved a lot of time in creating these files by hand. Essentially what's happening is all of these actions, they're called actions, are essentially views in the app. So if we go down to our views folder, in this folder you'll see all of this kind of the same naming conventions for these methods in this file. So there's a show view, there's an index view, there's a new view, and an edit view. There isn't a create view because just the way Rails works, a create is what would be the post request in a given Rails app. So that happens all kind of via a form typically. And then the same is true for update requests. So those all kind of are based on the form you're working with. And then destroy is going to be where you actually delete the file or record in the database. So it goes and finds it and destroys it. And these all have these respond to blocks in these actions. And what's neat about these is you can respond to almost any file format. Typically in a Rails app, it's HTML, but you could do JSON and even JavaScript rendered responses here. So if your app's a front-end app, you'd probably do JSON more than HTML here by default. And with that said, Rails itself has an API mode. So if you were to create a new Rails app, brand new, and type --API, it'll actually set itself up for JavaScript-driven apps by default. So again, another reason people reach for it. And we'll go too deep here. I'll get kind of in the weeds here in a second once we get into the view layer. But Rails has its own conventions with HTML as well. As you see, these are called .html.erb files. So essentially, it's a neat way of saying, hey, I can write Ruby in these files, and that is what we do. So any entry that comes back from the controller layer, which is where this is all derived from. So notice how index correlates to this index file in the views. We're actually grabbing that instance of entries from here. So those are all connected. And then we're looping through, this is Ruby, and then printing out the meal type, the calories, proteins, carbohydrates, fats, and then some actions we can perform on it, whether it's to go to the show path or this file and see what was saved, or to edit that file, we'll go to this file, and so forth. Under the hood, Rails comes with these URL helpers or link to helpers, which are essentially a neat way of saying it creates the hrefs in HTML for us that have these paths pre-baked in, so we don't have to remember what actual routing would be. And it's very dynamic in the sense of things. And if you were to want to understand where those routes could be useful, you could visit a certain URL in your Rails app locally and see all the routes in your app. It's super useful. I'll show you that in a second once we get going here. So essentially that's it in terms of structure. All of our assets in terms of style sheets would fit and underneath the hood here. There's that scaffolds file that's in here by default. I'm actually going to delete this because we're going to reference Bulma particularly in this app. And I'm actually going to change this one to a SCSS file, since if we were to write any specific Sass, I don't think we will. We would render that here. Now there's a lot to unbake in this folder, but honestly I don't want to spend too much time there. It's not that important at this point. I will point out that there is a folder called JavaScript here. And this folder is where you would import any of your ES6 equivalent kind of JavaScript. This is where you could add pretty much any framework under the sun. And there are specific commands in the Rails app that allow you to do that if you want to do like React or Vue or Svelte, like I said in the beginning. Again, beyond this topic of this basic crash course, I just want to get you familiar with the basics of the framework first and how Rails works in terms of HTTP requests and editing data and so on and so forth. So if we were to go to our actual app now, we're going to be presented with an error. So I'm going to say Rails server again. Actually, we're running a server already, so we were actually told that. If we go to the app, it's going to say this. And what's happened is because we created that new table, there's a new migration in the stack that the app knows about, but it hasn't migrated yet. And that's this file here that we checked out before. So it's got that create entries file. So what's unique here is that until we migrate, will this app boot up. So we can actually just do it from here. Or if you want to be, I guess you could say the old way is Rails db migrate from the command line. This is the way I'm used to, and it's quicker in a sense. So you can run that, or click that button in the web view if you want. That's totally fine. But then it prints out a timestamp of when this entry was created, and then it goes ahead and migrates the table. So that at this point, that table is created in our app. And what's neat is it generates this file I mentioned earlier called schema.rb. And this is a Ruby file that's essentially a way to just visualize or see what's going on in your database at any given moment. This isn't a file you want to change. It is one you would just reference in a sense. Notice it has timestamps that change basically as you add more migrations. And you wouldn't really add a migration by hand. That would be something you generate from the command line just to save yourself some time. You can generate anything under the sun in a Rails app. So Rails generate model. So then you could just do like new model. You could do, we'll do short for controller, tests, anything like that. You can generate a helper, all those, or even there's even mailers baked into this framework. So you could send emails, like transactional emails if you wanted. So that's all baked in, and that's super useful. As we migrated, we could see our app again, but we want to actually see that scaffold we just created, that entry scaffold. So let's go to what will be called a routes file. And you can find your routes file in your config folder, and there's going to be a file called routes. So if you remember that scaffold we created, there was a line called resources entries. That's part of how our routing is working. I'm going to delete this line for now so it's clear. Here we set up our app to draw each route in the app based on what resources we have available. And a resource typically points to what would be normally a model, but you can create one-off routes if you wanted to. They're just like get my route, something like that. If you wanted, there's a ton of stuff under the hood you could do. But the gist is that this one-liner creates what I'm about to show you. So we'll go to this specific URL, Rails info routes. Notice all of these here were added. And you can check out this stuff down here. This is all kind of stuff that comes with the typical Rails app these days, but you don't really need to worry about it for this video. That resources one-liner route created all of these, I guess, HTTP requestable routes. So in this case, we've got a get, a few gets, a patch, which is an update, a put is another update, a delete, and then a post. So all these correspond, as you recall, in the controller to those same naming conventions. So again, a very convention-driven framework. So entries index corresponds to entries path. Entries create would be entries, it would have the same thing, we just pass a post request through. Entries new will have its own little URL helper, so new entry path. Now it can be URL as well. So the difference here is path is relative, so it wouldn't have the full website URL in there, whereas URL would be absolute, which would actually have the whole website path. You'll need both in a typical app. Some routing, some like emails, for instance, need that full URL, but in the app, you can use the actual path version. So this all comes for free thanks to that one command, and that's super valuable. So you don't have to save yourself some typing. There's a lot more to unbake into or unpack into the routing. Again, I'd recommend checking out the documentation, or of course my channel if you're interested. While we've added our routing, we need to actually go back to add a route path. So right now our app boots to the welcome screen in Rails, which is part of the gem. It's not actually part of our app, but it more or less is part of the gem in the Rails app. And I forgot to mention gems, so why don't I do that quick. Within every Rails app, there is this file called the gem file. And this is actually just kind of a Ruby convention. It's not necessarily a Rails convention, but this is how you can install dependencies for your app. So each app by default comes with what you see here. And some of this is relative to certain environments. So in our development environment, we get specific gems. In our test environment, we get specific gems. And in our main environment, which is anything up here, we get all of these that run in pretty much every capacity. So what's neat about this is if you need a specific gem for a specific task, you can add it here and run this command bundle. So bundle install is typically how you would install a gem if you wanted to add a gem specifically. So I know there's a gem called, I just added it to another app, gem add Twitter, bundle add Twitter, excuse me. So if you go, it goes and fetches that. If you come from JavaScript land, if you know maybe NPM or Node or Yarn in particular, you might know how this convention works. I would argue to say bundle or bundler is where those gain inspiration from. So this is the Ruby way, but it's hearsay. So just think of it kind of like that in the sense of how you install dependencies, but you don't have to do it the same way. A typical site I'll reference Ruby gems from is right here. It's rubygems.org. You can search any gem. There's a ton that are still pretty lively and some that are outdated since Rails is quite an old framework, but it's still very mature and well polished. I mean, Shopify and GitHub are using it, so I'd say that's good enough for me. Process of adding a gem can happen from the command line like that, or you can go and copy and paste the actual name of it from like a GitHub repo and add it here, and it'll go ahead and fetch it. Now, when you add a gem manually, you would need to run bundle install, and it'll go fetch the dependencies for that gem and that gem itself. Now, we don't really need the Twitter gem in this specific case, so you can actually just remove it, and I'll save that file and just run bundle. You could run just bundle if you want in this case, and it'll do the same thing instead of bundle install. And that updates what you might know if you've seen like a yarn lock file. There's a gem file lock file as well. Again, I think inspiration from things of today. So that's a quick overview of the gem file. We won't be adding any third-party gems to this app just because we don't need to, I don't think. But this is where you would if you needed to reference a gem. And gems are very useful, so I wouldn't be scared to add any to your app. They do come with, you are dependent on them, but they aren't something that you should frown away upon if you need something special. Okay, so with our app set up, we need to go and add that route path I was just talking about. So routes, a way to add the route path in this case, we'll just say route to, and then we need to kind of call out a specific controller in our case, since the controller logic is going to be what requests route through. So entries index, and what that means, it's going to go to the entries controller and find that index action and route to that. So when we boot up our app anywhere, it will go to that file, that path by default now instead of the welcome screen we see. So to make that a little more clear, if we go to the entries controller, it's going to actually route to this action that we saw before. And I'll get to what more of the stuff in this file means in a second. I just want to kind of show you the scopes of everything else first. So we've got our app running. You could probably maybe reboot it, but I think we're fine to just refresh at this point, and it should redirect us back to our route path, which is entries right now. Now we don't have any styles installed. I deleted that scaffolds file, and that was up by design because I want to add Bulma next. So if we were to go to overview and Bulma, I think it's bulma.io, yeah, and start, you could install this like with NPM or Yarn in our case, but I'm going to actually add it just via the CDN to save us some time. And you might be wondering where do I add this? It's actually going to be in the views folder, and then you might have saw this layouts folder. And this is what you would call, I guess, the main template of your apps. So there's one for both the mailer and the application itself. And you can have multiple layouts depending on what you need, and you can establish layouts based on wherever you want in your app if you want a specific one. But I've seen mostly apps use kind of a standard base layout and then kind of just extend it from there. What we'll do for our app is add first that meta tag that came from Bulma, just copy and paste it over. And then we're going to go and add their version that's a CDN port. So right here. So this file we'll paste in right there. And then we'll have Bulma by default. Now I'll refresh this page and you'll see things kind of just cleaning themselves up, which looks pretty good, but very naked at this point, so that's fine. Now to get started, let's go and make our actual app. We have our title of our app that's called food log. So in our HTML file, you see it up in our browser tab there. It's called food log. Next we can add a container class around what's this called this yield statement. And this yield is essentially the way where the content of the main app will render. So whatever you're going to render basically app wide will be injected here, thanks to how Ruby and Rails work. So that'll kind of shift things more center in our app and get us ready to roll there. Inside each of our views, you might notice, so in our index view in particular, up at the top, there's this notice method. And the way Rails works with controllers is it can actually display a notice when things happen under the hood. So after you create a post, or an entry in this case, this notice will inject this text into that variable we just actually spotted. And I'm mentioning this because this is more of a global thing. So I think it fits better within this file instead of what the scaffold treats as home here. So we'll actually cut this out of this file and I'll paste it in the top under the body section of this file. And what I'm going to do is actually kind of do a conditional check if it's actually present. So we can do a little bit of Ruby within these HTML files. And Ruby, if you're not familiar with Ruby, it's a fairly simple language to learn, but there are a lot of hidden quirks. Again, it's a dynamic language, so I would say it takes a lot of time to master, but it's quick to pick up. So there's a command in Ruby called present. We could check out if basically there is a notice and then render it. So I'll leave that alone. I'm going to get rid of the ID. Bulma comes with some classes that we can actually prepend to this and call notification is link and then is light, and be sure to round out the div. Now what's great is there's another one called alert. So this is typically what displays if there's an error, like say you submit the wrong data in a form. We'll present that in this way as well. Maybe just changing the colors up. Danger is light. So this one will be kind of a red hue and this one will be a bluish hue. So we'll leave it at that. What I want to do is eventually render a header above these. Bulma comes with some predefined header templates, so we can actually kind of go that route. What's great is within ERB files you can render partials, and if you're not familiar with how partials work, if you look into our main app right now and go to the new file within the entries folder, this is how a partial gets injected into another page. So you typically pass this render function or method. Within it you pass what you're rendering. In this case we're rendering this underscore form file, and the underscore basically tells Rails that that is a partial. We want to render that as a partial into another page. And you can even pass variables through. So in this case we're passing the variable entry or the instance of entry through to the actual form itself. So in that case, the form, again, this is all Rails specific stuff, has all of these entry local variables available to it since we passed it through in that way in the new file. So right here, this actually is the instance that gets passed through, and then we're able to use it in this file specifically right here. Now I'll talk more about this file in a second when we do some cleanup of the HTML, but for now that's just how that would work if you're thinking of partials. All that's to say is I want to render a partial into our application file, and I want it to be called header. So what I'll actually do is create a new folder in our app that's going to be called shared and then header. So we need to create that in our views folder. So I'll actually do so and create a shared folder. Inside that, we'll create an underscore header.html.erb file. And then I could just say I'll just do like a proof of concept here. So my header. Save that down. If we re-render the app at this point, you'll see that text appear. So that's working. That's great. Now what we want to do is actually use some Bulma for that. So I know there's some kind of pre-baked template markup we'll probably reference. So maybe I'll go get that now, modified it. So I'm going to copy and paste most of this over. We'll paste it in that partial just to get going with it. So then if we render the page here, we've got at least the markup. It's not dynamic by any means, but it is markup. And we don't have the icons. I'm not going to really use icons. I don't think we need them. But I'm going to make this one small. I think it's a little too big otherwise. And then we can change our logo up in a second. But we'll leave things alone. Probably just remove all of these links for now. We just need to remember we're going to do a link to new entry path class button is success. So we'll have kind of a blue button. Now on these helpers, you can do them inline like so. I'm getting ahead of myself here. So you could just say like create new entry. In fact, I will. I'll just do create new entry. And show you kind of what's going on. It might not work right just because of the spacing. So Bulma expects a span tag there, but let's make this actually is link. So it's blue. There we go. That kind of looks like I showed you in the beginning. But you see it's how it's at the top there. That's not exactly how we want it. But typically this is how a traditional link to helper works. You pass the text of the link there. You pass the path of the Rails route there. In this case, we're going to create a new entry, so we need new entry path. And then the classes you can append to. And there's a lot more you can add to that. The documentation, again, is one of your places to figure out all the stuff you can add. But under the hood, it adds this class with the href of entries/new. That's all convention driven there. But let's add that span tag. So to actually do that, we need to make a block version of this link. And to do that, you just throw a do block at the end, and then remember the end tag here, otherwise this will not work. Now you might think this could work at this point too, but this format assumes there's no text-based option there, so you need to do it here instead. And in this case, to get the spacing we need for Bulma to work, we need to just pass a span tag like so. And that still doesn't work, so that's interesting. I think it's because I still need the span tag here, actually. So span class navbar item. Okay. See that? There we go. So that might be not really necessary. Let's see if it is. Remember to remove the do block. Okay, so it's not. Great. Okay, so that gives us at least a button that does something. So we could click that now and it'll actually go to the new path. The URL up here goes to entries/new. And you'll notice that form we were actually looking at earlier with all those fields. It looks like garbage, but we'll fix that. Up here, well, I want to remove these nav elements. We don't need those at all. So I'm going to actually just kind of remove the footer itself and render that. Now the title is going to be actually dynamic, and I think it's going to be kind of a neat part because we want to actually render it based on the date. So the way to do this is using that yield statement we saw before, but what's neat is you can pass in custom yields. So we could say yield, in our case I'll just call this title, And that's great. You could check if that exists though, and that's kind of nice too. So we'll say if content for title will render whatever we pass through. And I'll show you how this works in a second if it's not quite clear. But we can actually throw an else in line here too, and just pass in the name of the app instead. So food log in this case. And I'll actually just remove subtitle. I don't think we need that. Okay, so that gives us food log because we didn't really yield to title at all. Now, if we wanted to, I'll show you by example how this works in our index path. Eventually, we'll add a date based on our entry itself. That's going to basically show the current date. So we'll say in our index HTML file, content for title, do another rupee block there. We could say food log, and I'll just do like a in dash HTML version, and then we could just say like date time.now. It's gonna look funky, but we'll fix it. And there we go. So that gives a timestamp of the current time and date. Again, we'll fix that because it looks bad, but we'll notice how it's dynamic. So on any index action, I could change that. Here, I could render something different on this page. It's all relative to whatever you want to throw in that context. I forgot to delete this from the show view, so because we have it here, if you recall. So I'm going to go ahead just to remove those for now. So those should only really be on the show and index views. So there's other files in this folder, the JBuilder ones. You can go and assume, you can either delete those or keep those, but that's just a way Rails hooks into another gem and renders JSON in a very automatic way that we won't really use in this app, but you could. So if you were to ever want to render entries.json, I think you can. And in my Firefox browser, it'll actually display it as JSON here once we have it. That's just kind of a nice to have, or if you need it at all. So on our traditional app, let's go ahead and create an entry just to show something. Let's create one called breakfast. Calories will be like, I don't know, 600. Whoa. 30, 20. Random numbers here, guys. So 50, 10, create entry. Okay. Here's that notice we created, and remember that was added here. It's got the link classes and it's light, so that actually works quite well for us. Now it doesn't dynamically go away. You need to add some JavaScript to the app to do that. We won't get into that, but that's just something to be aware of. Refresh this page, it'll actually go away by itself. On this page right here, we're actually on the show template. So any route you see with the actual ID, that's going to be the show template. And on this template, it typically just shows the data for that specific record and mention in the database. So in our case, we just created this one. It has these calories, the breakdown and whatnot. So we can go ahead and go back to our edit page, and you see all that data still present in the form. We could go back to the show page, you'll see that again, or back to our index path, and you see the state of things right there. So what I want to get into next is kind of just cleaning up these views so it looks a little nicer. I'll do that quickly. Spend too much time with this. By default, the scaffold with tables, it's not the most useful thing in the world from a designer's perspective, but it does seem to work when you need it. A scaffold isn't meant to be taken as like the final product anyway, so. Okay. So we're going to start on our index view first, just because this is the kind of the root path to our app at this point. Just kind of get rid of any cruft we don't need. I'm actually going to remove this link. And what I'll add is some Bulma markup. So we'll have a columns class. I'm using Emmet to kind of autocomplete this stuff. It's another plugin for VS Code if you want to check it out. MT6 is centered. These classes all come from Bulma, so if you're wondering where they come from, that is where. And then right here is the Ruby looping mechanism. So it's quite simpler than most loops you see elsewhere. And in modern JavaScript, you might have a for each loop or something like that, where you loop through an array. This is kind of the same thing, only entries is kind of a hash or a collection in Ruby instead of a typical array. Or it's an array of hashes, I should say. So let's get the column is 1/4. Just want to kind of give these all their own little look and feel. We're going to give a card class next. So card. Actually, I'm going to go steal. I'll follow my notes here. Card. So the main card class will be wrapped that way. In the card class, we'll have a header class, card header, and that will have the entry meal type. And below that, we'll have a div card content. And within that, there's another class called content. That's kind of just a generic content class that comes from Bulma. We'll have each of our kind of entries based on the macros. So these won't really have any, they're just text at this point. So we need to add some formatting. So I'm going to do, for each of these, I'm going to do kind of the same look. Span class has text, weight, bold. Close that off. At the end, I'm going to end the span, but then for each of these, we'll end the paragraph tag as well. And then after each, I'll just say calories, not each, but grams of protein, grams of carbohydrates, and then grams of fat. Okay, and then we could kind of add a timestamp too, and just do a generic like italic class. And I'll say it was logged. A nice time helper in Rails is one called time ago in words. Another benefit of a framework, you just have these available to you. And then this field that we got created by default. So if you recall the timestamps declaration and that migration we added way back when, this thing here it's basically a created at and updated at field to use. So updated at's useful if you're like doing editorial kind of things, and then created at's useful if you just want to know the birth date of some type of file. Or not file, record. Then we'll do a card footer to round this out, so pass that down. I'll clean up this formatting. Okay, and each of these are going to have a class of card footer item. So I'm going to kind of do the command click cursor thing in VS Code and say card footer item. And that's, I didn't say this before, this is how you add HTML classes to ERB based stuff. So you'd add, it's a little bit backwards than typical HTML. Okay. Now we can check this out and see how it looks. So there's our basic look and feel. Looks like I might have something wrong with the header class. Yeah, we need an actual class here for card header title. There we go. So that's our first entry. That was what we added in that form. And I need like an ago here. There we go. So This is kind of a nice helper. Like it'll start with minutes, it'll actually start with seconds, minutes, days, hours, etc. until it gets to like several days, and then it'll say days ago and whatnot. So it's kind of dynamic in that way, which is kind of nice. But to get this timestamp to actually look like I want, we need to kind of add to the framework a bit. So what I tend to do is go way back into our configuration part of the app and create a new what's called initializer. So all of these files in this app are loaded when the actual app boots. So we would need to restart the server for this to take effect. But what I want to add is a new time format that's kind of just preset. Ruby has a ton of ways to render time in a certain string format. This will basically create that customization for us that we can reference it in the view in a nice handy helper based way. So what I'll do is create a new file called timeformat.rb, and it's going to have a pretty seemingly simple file or content, and we're going to hook into the time class of Ruby itself, and for Rails we'll pass in formats, so that's part of the standard string formats we can pass, and hook in and pass one called nice date. You can name this whatever you want, and this is a symbol in Ruby. This is a class. This is a constant on the class. Yeah, there's a lot to Ruby, but if you're not sure of it, definitely check the documentation and kind of get familiar. There's some other sites like Code Academy and whatnot that have decent starter guides on Ruby itself. So this format is what's going to render the actual date format that we want. So in this case, we're going to get like the full year, I honestly can't remember. So I'll save this down and you'll see what I mean. So what we need to do though, for this to take effect, is go back to this view in our terminal. We've got our server running. How do you quit it? Control C on a Mac will do that. So what I tend to do is hit the up arrow again in the same instance. If I would only ran Rails server before, and you get that command right back. And so I'll run it again. And then we can go back to our app and hopefully see nothing yet because we didn't use this, but let's see if it works. So the way we'd access this, where I want to take effect initially is in this top portion here in this content for block. So what I'll do is actually do .now and then render it to a string. So that's a method in Ruby to render the format to a string, and we'll pass that new time format stamp we created, that symbol. So in theory this should render right back to where we want it. So that's the nice look and feel that I'm after, which is perfect. So that takes care of the index view. If we were to add another one, we could do launch J, yeah. So 500, I don't know, 23, just random here. There we go. We go back and then we have 2. So that's how that all works. We've got our edit. And if you want to delete one, you totally could. I won't, just so we have some stuff to view and to save some time, but that's just the way it's looking right now. This is probably bugging you guys that I don't have the right logo. So I'll do that quick. Okay, so I did a basic span tag. And I actually want to make this a link back to the root path of the site. So what you can do, and what's handy, thanks to Rails, is just call root path, since we have that set now in our routes. And then we can pass the Bulma class we need, so navbar item, and then, if I can type, a do block. And then within that, I want to add a SVG. I'll do that in a second. And you can reference the source code. I'll paste a link to it in the description. I'm going to just pass some Bulma stuff here. And we'll say food log. So that gives us the look of our app at the moment. And I need to do a dash there. So there we go. I wanted to pass a SVG into this code. I use an app called Nucleo and some Zondicons. I think Steve Shoger, if you've heard of Tailwind and that crew, he's one of the designers for it. So if we say food, I think I used this one. These are open source, so you can use them pretty sparingly if you want to. One thing that's a gotcha here is I just need to remove this little G tag. It kind of adds a color to it. I actually want to set the fill to white. There we go. And I'll close this app, refresh. There we go. We've got our logo. Not perfect, very quick and yeah, but it works. Okay, last thing to do is take care of these form views. They don't look very good, so let's make sure they do, at least in terms of Bulma's setup. What I want to do for each edit, if you notice edit and new share the same form partial, that's by design, which is handy. So what's great is we can just kind of copy some of the stuff over and already be in good shape. So we could say columns dot is centered margin top 6. Just wrap this all up. And then I did one column. I kind of wanted this to shift to the center and a smaller width. So I just did column is 1/3. So we'll shift that over. And then our H1 for this page will have class is size 2, has text weight bold, and margin bottom 3. And then we could close that tag. We'll have editing entry. We'll render our form. And I'm actually going to remove these links. I don't think we need those. So if we go to our edit view now, we get this look and feel. Our form still needs some love. We'll get that now. So thanks to Bulma, this is almost already done. One thing we need to do is for the errors that would render, if we were to render any, we need to kind of account for those. So instead of this ID error explanation, I'm going to add a class. Message is danger. And then we'll have a message header. That's going to wrap around this H2, or it will be a P tag actually. Div. And that's good. If you're looking at this method pluralize, basically it takes a count. So if there are any errors, it counts what's in that array of errors and outputs a pluralized version of this word. So if there's only one error, it'll say one error. If there's only like 4 errors, it'll say 4 errors. It's kind of an inside scoop there. And then we could do, make sure this looks pretty good. Fix the indentation a bit. Okay, so that's if we have errors. I'll show you how that looks in a second when I talk about validating these fields. For each of the labels, we'll have a class of label. Oops. I need to do that. We can actually just kind of do a Command D, select all these, go to the end, come back, label, down a line. These will have a class of input. Field is actually already one of the classes we need for Bulma, so that's already looking good. And then finally, on our bottom submit button, this will be a button that actually outputs. We'll need a class button is success. Now you notice there's no text to say what this button actually reads as. That's kind of a convention as well, thanks to Rails. So based on the path you're at, new or edit in this case, it'll say a certain thing. So we'll fix that up in a second. I'm going to copy pretty much the same stuff over to the new file. And I'll show you the difference here. Instead of editing entry, we'll just say new entry. And it's all the same. So we'll just paste that in and save it. Close some of these files up. And I believe we should be in good shape. So now we have this look and feel thanks to Bulma. This was us editing an entry. If we update, we'll go back to the show view and then back to our index view. What's left to do is essentially the show view. We've got our new entry form. See, it's using the same form partial, so everything kind of looks the same except for this headline. So if we go back to our app and do edit on this one, we'll see editing instead, and then the data that propagates to each field thanks to the database that's loading that stuff up. Now, if we were to go to the show view, it looks like this. So let's tackle that now. Entry show. This is what you're getting with the scaffold. It's not that pretty, but we can make it that. So content 4, we'll do that again here. This will allow us to do like a more dynamic naming convention for what entry we've added. So in our case, we could say like entry meal type. And then we could display like an in dash, kind of like we did before. And then our date timestamp again. So date time now to string, nice date. There we go. So this was breakfast on August 27th, 2020. If we go back to here, it's food log August 27th, 2020. This is all going to update based on the date that this was authored. So that's pretty dynamic and useful. Okay, so continuing on, I'm going to do more of the Bulma stuff here. So we'll just do columns, margin top 6, that is centered. Wrap that all. I'm going to get rid of these p tags and these strong tags. Okay. And meal type will be there. We can do, I think there's a panel component, column is 1/3. Again, we're going to shift this to the center and kind of a smaller looking unit. Nudge this over. Save that down. Meal type will have a panel. It's actually going to be a nav. So we can say nav.panel.isLink. And within that, we'll have our kind of look. Panel heading will be, whoops. Our meal type. You don't even need these labels per se. Calories will be, these will be panel blocks. So we'll just kind of copy this down. Oops. I'm going to keep the calories there actually. Okay, so I'll just kind of follow suit with these two or three. Come on. There we go. Okay, so that's that. We still need the like bottom portion of this to do some utility stuff around it. So I'll do another columns, and then is mobile to kind of account for that. It's not, I wouldn't call this app very responsive friendly, but it's got Bulma, so it wouldn't be far off to go ahead and go back through and make it that way if you wanted to pull it down. I'll be sharing a GitHub link that you can download this from. Give it some button is gray. Move that back. We don't want back here. Instead, we can do a delete. So a delete button is going to reference the same entry path. So in this case, we could say entry path and then pass in which one. So we've got that instance variable of that entry since this is the show view. And how that works is on the controller layer. If you go back to the controller layer, there's this set entry method at the very bottom of the file. And there's this concept of parameters where based on the request, there's an ID in the parameter. Now, if we were to go to this show view, I'll show you what a parameter looks like, which you have available to you in any instance of the app, which is called params. When you echo that out, you get this little bit of data about what's going on with the params at this stage. So in our case, we're on the controller entries as we just were showing, and that action is show. So in this case, we're on the show view, and the ID is what we're kind of paying attention to here. So in this case, it's 1. Now, if you go back to that controller file, you might notice there's an ID symbol here, and that's what we're actually going to find based on what's in our database. So to find that, you'd pass the class of the entry itself. So in this case, this is calling the model class, which is located here, the one we were talking about way earlier. And it's finding that entry based on that ID and that parameter session. So you're able to kind of pluck that stuff out of the database to get data on it in this way. Now, how is this going to coincide with this show route or action? Right here is another handy way that Rails does things kind of in a more dry approach. So don't repeat yourself is the kind of common programming lingo. And in a way, this is a kind of a callback. So if you think of something that happens before something else, this is what that is. So here we're calling that method way down here and finding that entry based on its ID. And then we're using it automatically in these other actions. So we're only, in this case, only the show, edit, update, and destroy actions. So we don't even have to, if you didn't have this here, you would have to define this method, basically this line here otherwise. And now that gets repetitive because you're ending up needing to do it on edit, on show, on update, and destroy to find that ID. So in this way, this boils down to a one-liner and then a single method to kind of call it on each of those actions. So I hope that makes sense. It's probably a little fuzzy, but if not, if it is, I think just over time you understand it a little bit more. Now we want to delete this path, and that's where we're calling that entry we found based on that method in the controller. So it's important to know that this is where that's coming from. So in this case, this will have that ID of 1, but we don't need to reference 1 anywhere, which is great. So we could just say method. In this case, we're going to do a delete HTTP requests and call in that route. Since it's delete request, it's going to point to this destroy method. Now, Rails has a handy destroy method that you just chain to the object, and it'll handle it that way. So it's basically going to the database and deleting that record from it. Then this is kind of the magic of the framework. So in this case, we need to pass a method because we're deleting it, and then we could just do with some of the data attributes. Rails ships with this library called Rails UI.js, and that's kind of installed via our JavaScript. So if you go into JavaScript packs application.js, there's this UJS library. And that's just kind of some built-ins that come with Rails that are helpful in the case of when you delete a record, you might want to do a confirmation window, kind of confirming that case. And this is doing exactly that. So we can call this confirm, and then we'll just say, are you sure? And then pass another class at the end that does the button and then is gray. And I'll show you in the HTML how this looks so you get an idea. We'll do another column here, and we'll come back to this portion and add something coming up that I want to do to show you kind of the full index of entries instead of just the view of the current one. So what I want to do first is remove this line, save that down so we don't spit that out. Now under the hood, if you see this link, it's the A tag. It's got our classes, and then this data confirm message. And that's just a way to pass a message through to the browser. So on this dialog, notice it's when I click delete, it goes and does this. That's that UJS library I was talking about. That's a little bit of JavaScript making that work for us. And then edit goes right back to our form, just like it would. Okay. So with that done, we've got our views stylized and looking pretty good. Everything's kind of working swimmingly. I was shown in the beginning of the app, there was this actual index of all of your dates and entries. So let's do that next, and I'll show you how that works. So I'll do a generation on the command line to generate the next part. That's going to kind of save us some time. So I'll open up a new tab. I've got one open here. I'll just clear that off. So video Rails generate controller. I'll just create a static controller. Typically a controller is plural in the naming conventions. So in our case, this one's going to be static. It's kind of more geared towards just generic stuff. You could call it anything else like archives or something like that, just to show the index of everything. But that's what we're going to focus on here. I'm going to pass an all name to this. And this will essentially be, in fact, I'm going to call it archive, just so this might be a little more clear. And then I'll pass this name all. So this is a method on that controller. The controller name is going to be called archives controller. And then on it, we're going to have, within the class on that controller, we're going to have an all action. All will correspond to kind of everything that we've input so far. And traditionally, you could do that. It's not the most, what they call restful way. So instead, we might do something like index, and that gives us an index of all of our archives. So I think that makes a little more sense. And that's kind of the convention you would uphold by with Rails when you name things, especially. There's a lot of conventions to understand and kind of get in the habit of using. But it's once you do, it kind of makes more sense, and it's easier to spot bugs and find errors and solutions to errors when you do some Googling like I have. So let's go ahead and run this. It's going to generate our views and our helpers, all that stuff you kind of saw on the scaffold, but a little less because we didn't generate a model with this. We didn't generate any of the kind of data layer side of it because we don't really need it with this part of the app. So let's go and create the routes. I'll show you how that looks now. We've got, find it. This was added thanks to that generator. So that's already kind of doing what we need. We don't really need anything more than this. If you were to extend archive to be a little bit, more verbose, you could do that. But in this case, we should be fine. Actually, what I want to do is change this to archives. So I'll show you a nice to know thing. So if I did this generator, but you might want to undo what you did. So instead of generate, so you could say Rails delete, or D for short, controller archive. And it'll go back through and kind of find and replace and remove that stuff. So what I actually wanted to write is generate controller, pluralize this one, so archives, and then index. There we go. So notice it's archives now. That's just kind of a tradition or convention, I would say, to Rails, especially with actual full resources. So notice entries itself was plural because we scaffolded that whole thing. But in this case, we just need the basics. So in this controller, I'm going to actually we're going to call our entries as well. So I'll just say entries. And what I want to do is get entry, and then we're going to group by a specific, we'll get entry all first. And this is basically going to pull all the entries back and display them in kind of just the way they were added to the database. So basically by created at date. And I'll get into more of maybe how that works in a second, where you can query here for specific things. Because you can do things like ordering, or you can do like where some attribute is true, like featured true, something like that, to allow you to kind of bring back the data you want instead of just all of it, So for now, we're going to leave that alone. We did create a view with this, so let's go get that rolling for now. So it'll be in the archives, And when you generate a new view, this is what's inside. It's nothing special, but we get that for free. I'm going to start getting the HTML part of this set up. So centered. Kind of do our usual thing. So column is half. And we're going to loop through all the entries here. Each do entry. And for now, I'll just do like entry meal type and just call that good and go check out the path it would be on. So maybe we can add a button to view all of the entries on the index. I'll do that now. This allows us to link over to that specific page instead. So at the bottom of our entries index view, I'll do this right below everything. So we'll just say columns is centered, and then margin top 6. Then we'll say link to view all entries. We'll say archives index path. And that's all named based on their routing. So if you recall in our routes, we've got I need to remove that one, but archives index. I think we still have some of the old stuff too. Archives controller, archives. Yeah. So archives index will be a get attribute there. So we get this naming convention as a result. So we can just pass class button is link is outlined is centered. See if that works in our view. There we go. So view all entries should take us to our entries, but we unfortunately don't have this working. So entries needs to be souped up a little bit. So archives controller entry.all. Interesting that that's not working. Oh, because I can't spell entries. There we go. So we've got both of those entries here. That's the same ones that are right here. But what I want to do is basically group these by a specific date. So each entry, I want to basically display each one corresponding to its date and not just each entry. So to do that, you can actually use a grouping mechanism from Rails. That's a nice thing to have in the sense of getting content to be grouped based on the looping mechanism. So in that case, we're going to do a group by, and then what I'll pass is an day here. And this kind of goes through each of the records and maps through the day, which will be a new method I'm going to create on the entry file, which basically hooks into another part of the column on the database. So self is part of Ruby, basically just calling itself. So you could say entry here and do the same stuff, or you could say self and it will reference the class. So we'll say created at. Part of Ruby, again, another time format you can pass. We'll do B, E, comma, year. So this is how we're going to kind of group it by that date stamp. And we'll get things going here. Right now it will error out because we need to loop through it a special way to make this work. And I'll show you how that works right now. So if we go back to this entries index, we've got entries at each, but this is actually kind of a sub array of data. So we actually need to pass that day entry now. And then we can call entries specifically. And this allows us to go one step further in this loop. So what we can do is first, I'll create a h3 class with size 4, has text weight bold, margin bottom 4 has text centered. So in here we'll do entries for day. since we've got that available to us in this loop now. That comes right here. And then we can get the sum of the day. So in this case, I'm going to do, first I'm going to do the loop below. So I'm going to say entries dot each do. And again, so there's a first start of the loop, and we actually need to end it. So we aren't, oh, we did end it. So we need to loop through this entries now, since we've got it grouped. This allows us to do that. So we could say entry do like a sub loop, and if you want to think of it that way. And then we'll do one big link to, it's going to wrap each entry. Do. And then we'll just present a card element. Just a basic break tag, and just kind of just basic text. So entry.calories, they're going to do it all in lines, so it's comma separated. All right, so that gives us what that would look like at this point. I'll show you. It looks like I need to do spelling, always off on the spelling. There we go. So see how it's grouped? And that's by design. That's what I wanted. So we get this one single date with this queried of sub entries for that specific date. So we've got that all ready to roll. I'm going to remove these spaces real quick. So then we get kind of just a high level of what's going on. Each of these link to their own perspective individual record. So in this case, we go to breakfast, and this one goes to lunch. So that's how that works. What I want to add still are some stats for the whole day, though. So what we can do above is present a nav class or nav element, and it's called level for a class. And say is mobile. I think I stole this straight from Bulma, but we'll just copy it for here. Level item has text centered. And then we did quite a few of these, so I'll just get the scaffold of it written, and then we'll go from there. So div first will be calories. And this is what we're going to do. We're going to go through all the entries. Dot pluck basically pulls out this singular database column and then gets the sum of them with Ruby here. So for each of these entries specifically, we'll just kind of do a little bit of operation to summarize each. So that's a super handy thing. And another reason I like, Ruby and stuff, it's just so simplified like this. Breakdown for the day is this stuff right here. This adds those two things. So we've got 23 and 32, adds to 55. And I could probably put grams for these. So protein grams, in the States it's grams. You might use something else where you're at. There we go. And like calorie, what is it, kcal? Something like that. If you want to go that route, I might leave that off. But that's generally it. So if we posted again for August 28th, we've got another day of this. There'll be this long index of this stuff. Eventually, you could add stuff like pagination to the mix the longer this goes on and how more consistent you are with documenting your food log. So that's the base of the app. That's the data layer. What I want to do real quick is talk about validation in the app. And right now, if you were to submit the form on any creation of a new entry, it would submit without anything, and that's not what we want. So we want some validations there. And what's great is you could do such that in your model, you can display those specific validations based on what you want to pass. So in our case, we want to validate that they're actually present. So a way to do that, and there's a ton of other validations, I just want to show you how it works right now. We want to make sure there are calories, proteins, carbohydrates, fats, and a meal type. And at the very end, we could say presence. If I can type presence true. So this essentially says these need to be input, otherwise this form will not submit. So if we go back, try to hit create entry again, we'll see that error status come back. So and these fields come back through based on the name of the field and then just the conventions of Rails. So we get this back, and it's super helpful in that way. Now you could do a ton more validations based on like what kind of entry it is. Say it needs to be a number, needs to be unique, needs to be capitalized or some sort of text formatted way. There's a lot to check off on that list. So go ahead and check out the documentation for that. One extra thing we could do is make sure this is actually for today. So this is just displaying to the date right now. And what I want to do is only get the entries that are created today. So if I were to create one tomorrow, it would show up here too, and then given the current date. That's not exactly what we want. So on the index of our controller, today we've got entries.controller. We're just displaying every entry. And that doesn't really make sense when you're logging in, or when you pull up this app, you're adding your calories. You probably don't want to see something from 2 weeks ago. Instead, you want to see what you're focused on, which is today. So what we can do is do a where query. We'll do a created at, and then we'll do a pass in basically greater than equal to what, and then we can pass what that what is, and today would be the case. So we can see date.today, and this won't really change, but if we were to add an entry, I don't know, and update it to yesterday, so maybe we could do a little bit of that. So if we say Rails console, and this is a great way to play with the data in your app. You could say entry, give it a local variable, and then we could call that same class in our app. So entry equals entry. I'm going to just say entry.last. It's like kind of a Ruby convention to say the last one that was created. And we're going to pull that back, and it'll pull back one. So if we say entry, we get some data about that entry. As you can see here, it's got some of the data based on what's in our database. So if we say entry.created at equals, let's see, how do we do this? Date dot yesterday. I think that might work. So we could assign it to yesterday's date, and we saved it by saying entry.save. You can command or control D to get out of that. Refresh your app, and you should only see today's stuff. So that because that yesterday entry was for August 26th in this case. So what we can do, I need to add some margin to that. Let's see, margin top. I'll put a little bit of margin on the entry header just so it's kind of not bumping up, but that's not perfect, but not terrible either. So we've got entries for both days now that we made that change, which is pretty useful. Finally, I want to talk about some testing in Rails, and that's specifically a pretty big convention to do more tests with the Rails framework, because Ruby is a little bit loosely typed, pretty dynamic language, and is something that you want to test to make sure a lot of things are what you might expect. So under the hood, there could be a whole new video about tests in general. I want to walk through just the scaffolded stuff since we've added that. In particular, there's these things called fixtures, which kind of are a way to mock your data in your database. So it's based on YAML files. And this is kind of a little more advanced. So if you want to stop here, that's fine. You've probably gotten the most of the framework, at least the basics of creating resources and doing things with Rails. But this is kind of more or less how you could do the testing side of it, which is pretty important. So we'll say lunch here, and you could put meal type breakfast. Think of this as just dummy data we can work with. And under the hood, Rails ships with mini-test. It's a library for testing in Ruby. Actually, I think it might ship with Ruby if I'm not mistaken, but basically it's just a way to confirm your suspicions of your code and do a lot on to it. That's just pre-baked into the framework. A lot of people tend to use a library called RSpec. It's just kind of a more enhanced version of mini tests. They follow the same ideals, but they are different in terms of syntax and everything else. So up to you if you want to kind of go deep on that end. What I want to do first is just talk about controller tests. I'm going to go through these pretty fast just so we get this video not too crazily long, but I want to respect your time. Anyway, to set up a new entry, we need an instance of like an actual object we'll use in a database. So to run tests in Rails, there's a whole separate database in your app typically to do such as that. If you were to check out your environments, there's 3 different environments by default. One's test, and there's ways to configure it if you want to do it independently. We are working in both development and test at this point. Production is a different one that you would, of course, do when you push a web app live like this. So what we want to do first is run this entries controller test and see what barks. Basically, you want to make sure the test fails first when you run a Rails test or a Ruby test. So to run a test, you would actually pass Rails test and then pass the actual file path. So in our case, it's going to be test controllers and then entries controller tests. And let's see what comes back. And right now we can't load the file because I think I passed the wrong path. Excuse me, it's Rails test and then test controllers, entries controller test. And then you'll see this boot up and run stuff. Don't worry about this readout here. This is all just kind of Ruby depreciated code. It's stuff you don't really need to worry about, but it's kind of annoying, I know. So right now everything's green because we didn't really modify anything to do with our controllers. But what I want to point out is just if you go to the entries index, for instance, you could run this test in a singular fashion. So if you do test past the line number that you see, so in this case we've got 8, it'll just run that specific test. I typed wrong again. So it'll just run that specific test. You notice it's green here. So typically you want a test to fail to begin with. So in this case, this is already set up. I just want to walk through it just to show you how this could kind of work in your own app if you create a new resource without scaffolding it. This is kind of the Rails scaffold way. So don't take this way as like the only way, but just a way to kind of follow in a pattern. So you basically, in a controller test, you're testing the responses. So in our case, we're getting the entries URL, which is our root path in this case, and we're asserting that that response is a successful one. The same is true for the new path. And then when you create an entry, we want to kind of confirm that we go to the last entry that was created and passing in post request, which is basically just asserting that it is a post request or a form is submitted. We're going to this specific URL with these parameters from the form. So in this case, it's what fields are being filled out. And then within this param of entry. So that I'm going fast. I know it's a little probably advanced for a crash course, but I just want to kind of cover tests because it's commonly overlooked in a lot of crash course stuff or beginner stuff, even though it shouldn't be. So edits the same way. We get an entry URL. We assert success. Updates quite similar to create, only we just assert it goes to a different URL. And then destroy is kind of the same. We just get the count of the model itself and make sure it is subtracted by 1. So all these assert difference and everything kind of come with mini tests and parts of Rails. Under the hood, we also have model tests. So entry tests, there's nothing here at this point, but we could add some. So let's do that real quick. Let's do a test and we'll call it is valid with valid attributes. This is basically saying we can create a new record and it is valid. And I need the do block. So what this would look like is we can create a new instance of entry in this case. So we could say like a local variable entry equals entry.new. Pass in our own parameters. So meal type. Just whatever. These need to be numbers since that's what we proteins. 20 fats, 10 calories, 400. And then we could just assert that it was saved. So entry.save. So basically it can be saved. Now a test, you actually want it to fail first. So if we miss one of these fields, what happens? So I'll try to run this now. It'll be a new path we'll type. So Rails test, models, entries, test. I think it's just entry test, excuse me. .rb. And to save some time, we could just pass the line 4. So it doesn't try to run the whole file, even though we'll get there. So it is failing, which we can see in red. So it expected to be false, or expected false to be truth. If we add that back, does it work? It does, so it's green. So that's a quick way to test that it is at least valid. Now, because we've added those validations, typically you would add that after the fact. So tests typically tell you what to go next if you're following test-driven development. So I did things backwards. I did the validations first, and now we're writing tests for that. Now you might find that's fine and that's useful. Some would argue that's not the way to do it. But to me, it's like preference, you know, whatever preference you should say, use that. So we want to test each field now. So we should say should not save entry without calories. Do end. We're going to basically do this for each field just to, you know, validate. So we could say carbohydrates. These are a little bit redundant because of this, but in this case, we could say, you know, if you've missed one, it should still pass the test. I just want to show you what kind of tests look like in this case. So proteins and fats. Okay, so now we've got each. Now I just need to assert that they're each that way. All you need to do is just go in entry.save, assert not in this case. But we want to take out the calories from this equation. Then we could run that, make sure, we could say first, yeah, we could just run that first and say 9. Cool, that one cast. We can also kind of make sure it doesn't work. So it still works. So these are, in all seriousness, these are redundant. So I'm actually going to remove those. Because if this doesn't save, it's valid in this way. So that's a quick run through of model tests. Let's go and work on a system test next. So a system test is kind of doing a little bit of integration with a library called Capybara. And it's a way that kind of uses a Chrome-based engine to actually fire up your browser, kick off some tests, run stuff through the tests, and then just verify it works. So it's quite wild when you first see it, but it's pretty neat. And I wanted to make sure this video actually has that. So at this point, we have this test that visiting the index path. I know it will fail because this isn't what is on the page. So we can run this test and just see what the browser kind of do what it does, just to give you an idea. So test system / entries test.rb. It's going to boot up a browser, do some craziness. Looking for that string, but it's not going to find, well, it ran the whole file, so excuse me. I should have ran just the line 8. Let's focus there. So it's kind of stalling because it's like, well, where is it? So I can't find that actual text class. So in our case, it'll be food log and then an in dash. And then we need to pass that timestamp we created. So we can run that again. Hopefully it'll pass. Yep, green. So how quick it is when it finds that is a good indicator that it did pass. Now we could run the next line, would be line 13. So instead of 8, we'll pass 13 down. And this should, I believe, fail. Yeah. Unable to find link or button new entry because we didn't have it there. So if we go to creating a new entry, we need to visit the index URL and find that entry. Now it's up here actually, but notice it's not saying new entry. So instead, if we change that to create new entry, and I believe it's lowercase, case matters in this case, we'll run that again. It can create that test. Find link back. So we don't have the backlink because we actually removed it. So I'm actually going to remove that entirely and run that once more. Green. Cool. So that worked. We can go down the line, updating an entry. So what was that, line 27? So again, it's looking for that backlink. We removed it from there as well. We can actually just kind of get rid of that. Run it again. Green. And then finally 41. I'm going extremely fast here. Typically tests are kind of going to take almost as long as coding an actual feature. So it's something you need to kind of think hard on, because you want to actually identify the flow you're creating and making a user go through. So in our case, we're visiting a path, we're clicking on something, we're filling in something else. These all correspond to a label name or the name of a field. And then we're passing in the actual, item of question. And then here we're going to like edit entry. You're going to match the first edit button and then go about our business there too. So all these tests are useful in that case because you can kind of almost go through the flow automatically and validate that it's working and acting as it should. But typically you want to almost write this first and then go build your feature so you can make sure you're on the right path. But sometimes, at least in my perspective, I'm more of a designer. First, I kind of like to get the design hashed out and then come back and kind of clean things up. Okay, so that's system tests. There's a lot more we could do. So like maybe for archives, we could just do Rails generate system test archives. So you can generate a test from the command line. In our case, we're going to do that in this way, and we could just do some quick and easy wins here. Maybe we're going to do that setup block. Do again initialize entry. We probably don't really need to do this, but there's only going to be one test here. And I'll just say breakfast. And again, this is just basically pulling in that dummy data from our fixtures files. So it all points to this. It's kind of just a convention, so it looks like magic, but that's what's going on behind the scenes. We're pulling in this that's named here to get these values as test data to use. And the setup block allows you to do it for any tests written below. So you have that instance variable available to you, so you don't have to type a new instance every time. So we'll say visiting the archives index. We just want to like validate there's some stuff on the page. So we'll say visit archives index URL. We need to use URLs in tests instead of paths. We're going to assert selector H1 is going to have a text of food log. And then assert selector H3 will have text of entries for entry.day. If you recall, day is what we added to our entry model. So entry model, it's this method here we're calling, which is going to output that timestamp we were after. And then we could say finally assert, just to verify this stuff's on the page. Entry dot meal type. Let's run that test. We just need to do a little bit of naming swaps here. So archives test.rb. We could run the whole suite. Looks like I did it wrong. Looks like I need a do block here. Forgot that. Run that again. So we've got an error. Archives, because I can't spell, so that's what tests are for. So archives, index, URL, try this again. And it's green. So cool. So we could do a controller test for this as well. We've got the index response is already kind of set here. This should technically work. If we just do Rails test now, let's see if we get a full suite that's green. And it looks like it is. So again, you don't need to worry about this Ruby output here. It's just part of depreciation warnings with newer versions of Ruby coming out. So up until now, we've covered a lot of topics, and relative to Ruby on Rails, it's such a vast framework. There's no way I can cover every little bit in this video, but there's a ton under the hood where you could extend the app or harness new features and other data. Right now we only have one model, and commonly in apps there's multiple models, and typically they're associated. So there's this concept of, it's called active record associations, and it's a way models can talk together or share data. Right now we have one class that's called entry. We could add another one that's maybe called the meal type, for instance. That could be an actual entire model of itself, or maybe a category model, you know. So let's try maybe just creating one just for grins right now. Just create the category model, or generate. Okay, and we'll do the same cleanup because it's just gonna conflict with our other styles otherwise. So we'll delete that. And we have that whole structure now, but they aren't associated per se. So a category and an entry are now two models that can connect if we want them to. So in my case, I want it belong to a category. So we can say belongs to category. And then a category is going to have many entries. So we could say has many entries. Now for this to work, and notice it's plural, that's a convention, and then belongs to is singular. For this to work, we need some ID to use to know how this can work. So an entry is going to essentially need a category ID that it saves to the database. So what we can do is kind of go through the mix of running that migration. Now we have category. Let's just say, I don't even know what this would be, like weight loss. Great. Okay, now we got categories. Great. Now here's our food log. If we go to our entries controller, nothing's really changed, but we need to add that. We've got that association set up in our model layer, but our database still needs that kind of construct. And the way you can do that is to add an ID attribute to the entries table. So if we refresh the schema, if we could just say Rails DB migrate again, it should spit out the new schema structure that we were expecting. Now we see this categories table, which means there is a new table in the database, but it doesn't have any connection to entries yet. So we can say essentially a one-off migration in this case. So we can say Rails generate migration. We're going to add entry or category ID. We'll just say category reference to entries. And then we could say category references. If we run this migration, it should create a new file for us that's actually kind of already made up. So based on the way we name that method right here, it's kind of getting cues of what it should do under the hood. And that's very convention driven again in Rails. There's some bit of magic going on under the hood, which some people love, some people hate. So what this does is adding a reference to the entries table, and we're pointing it at a category specifically. And then we're setting null to false, so it can't be null. And then a foreign key to true, just to kind of give it another root in the database. I'm going to go and change this. I'm going to just remove the foreign key and null and just run this again. There we go. So now we can have a category referencing an entry. So entry will have a category ID specifically. So notice the naming convention here. So it wouldn't be an ID because this was already going to have an ID attribute. So instead it takes the name of this table in its singular form and adds it with an underscore ID here. So that way we can query for that specific ID. So you can see all these conventions coming together and kind of doing their thing. It takes a while to understand and get this right. So don't fear if it's kind of confusing or, you know, just a lot to take in, but it's just kind of one of those things that once you get, it's just a pattern to uphold to. So we could here, for instance, go and find, we can create some new categories. I don't know, we've got weight loss. Let's just create a couple. So category is new. I'm going to this directly because we don't have any views set up. So we could say build muscle, just different maybe paths you want to go down. Okay, so if we go back, we've got our two categories here. I kind of might save time and not style these just so you get the gist here. But if we go to our form now and our entries, give it a new field. The form label, let's say category, class, label, and we can do like a select field. So form.select, we could get all the categories. And there's some kind of weird syntax with selects, but if we just get, I think it's, I might need to refer to Bulma's docs, but if we do that, I think it should render the way we want. I'm gonna put this at the end, actually. Let's see if this works. It might bark at us. So we've got category. We don't have everything spitting out just yet. Let's go to entries controller. We need to pass in category ID. So adding a category ID to the mix, we need to pass the form select value and get it to display all the categories. We're going to loop through with this all that collect and then kind of pass in for the parameters the title itself, and then the ID is the actual output. So if we look at the source, we can see entry category ID, and then the category itself and the options will be the values or the IDs of those categories. So this is a little advanced, and I understand it kind of is confusing, but this is a way to kind of associate that on the front end so a user can make their own selection of what category it belongs to. Real quick, I'm going to see what Bulma has to say about selects, and we can go from there. Components, elements, forms, select, div class select. Okay, so it needs a div around it. Let's just say select. There we go. I can remove this. I thought I needed this part. So instead we'll clean that up. Close that, and then we have Bulma's version of selects. So there we go. We got weight loss for that one. Now, right now this won't technically save because we need to actually permit it. And part of the permission process actually happens way back down here in the controller. I actually added this recently, but we need to permit this new parameter on the front end to allow it to come through the back end. So when a form is submitted, we actually pass these entry params in this case, and it's another convention. So it'll be whatever model you have underscore params. If you generate the controller like I did, it'll be passed when you create the new entry and then saved if it's valid. Now we have permit those fields right there, and then the category ID. We can go and validate that it has a category as well. We could just go to the model real quick entries, where am I at? Entry, and you could just say category ID. Like so. And then we could try this again. So like a food type or meal type would maybe be dinner. No, 1,200 calories, big meal. 20, 10, maybe more than that. And maybe since it's a big meal, we'll build muscle. Let's see if this works. So that saved. If you want to check what happened in the logs, it might give you an idea that we've got these parameters coming through. Notice the category ID is 2. This is a good way to kind of just debug your work, is to look when you're running your localhost server. You can see the stuff as forms persist and stuff that gets passed through. So in this case, our stuff was updated because we permitted that stuff in the controller layer. So if that's a little fuzzy, basically any field you add to your form, you want to actually append it here as a symbol, a Ruby symbol. Otherwise, Rails will reject it and not let it pass through. So all that's to say, if we go back to our index path and actually output the category, we can do so. So in this case, we could say meal type, I don't know, we'll just do like entry.category.title. And let's see what happens on the home page. Looks like that's not going to work. I know I called it title. No class. Oh, okay, so if entry category title, we could just say if entry category. So sometimes you need to check that these things exist. Let's just say present. There we go. So one has it, one didn't. That's why we're getting an error. So let me let's do something like that. So something like that. I don't know if this would be a use case you'd use, but it's just an idea of what you could do if you wanted to add this. But yeah, that's just a general idea of associations. So now we have categories available to us. If we wanted to go to edit this one, we could now add a maybe weight loss to it. So now we can go back to the food log. We've got weight loss, we've got build muscle here, and everything's square. So with if statements here, you can actually do them after the fact. Ruby lets you do that. You could do it surrounding this block, a lot of different ways. Ruby also has available unless, which is pretty neat. It's the inversion of if. So if you think about that, that's kind of nice. So we'll leave that alone for now. Maybe on the show view, I'll display the category too, just to keep it going. So entry dot category dot title should display. If we go to check one out, where's it at? Entry category title. Oh, it's up here. So excuse me there. I'll probably put that maybe here. Same kind of look as before. So this might bark if we go to this one. No, we do. We have it there. So that's great. So now any new entry is going to validate that that exists. So if we create a new one, we've got those things set up. Category by default is going to have a selection because one's already selected. So that's good. So the validation is kind of meaningless in a way, but it's just something to think about. So that kind of rounds out the validation or the relationships. So this can extend pretty deep. You can have complex relationships between multiple things. You can have like reusable relationships. So maybe like think of a blog post and comments or something of that nature where you might have comments on other things than blog posts. So maybe it's, you know, a form or whatever that you can actually use interchangeably throughout the app. So the sky is the limit. That wraps up our app, guys. I hope you enjoyed this. I know it was long. It was quite a journey, but that's the basis of running a Rails app, building a Rails app, and using testing-driven development, building a full CRUD app, and doing some dynamic stuff in terms of rendering and querying editing fields, etc. Hopefully you enjoyed this and learned a lot. Thanks again to Traversary Media for this opportunity and being an awesome channel to learn from myself. I learned a ton of JavaScript from the channel, and I'm really excited to see more that comes out, especially with the guest authors and whatnot happening now too. So if you enjoyed this, again, check out my channel. It's WebCrunch, and my website is web-crunch.com. This code will be in the description below. I'll share it with you. And if you have any questions, feel free to get at me on Twitter or my website or the channel itself. All right, guys, thanks so much for tuning in. Take care.